Canada, the country known for its calm diplomacy and quiet strength, just made one of the boldest statements about Filipinos ever recorded. After years of silent admiration, Canadian leaders are now saying publicly what the world has quietly known all along. The Filipino spirit is holding their nation together. From hospitals to tech labs, from classrooms to city halls, Filipinos aren't just helping Canada run, they're helping it rise. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. Canada, vast, diverse, and known for its quiet confidence, just witnessed a moment it didn't see coming. A moment that will be discussed in community halls, classrooms, and boardrooms for decades. Because the Philippines didn't simply win, it made history, and even Canadian leaders are now reacting. Here's the truth. When Canadians pause to talk about innovation or leadership, they often point to Silicon Valley, Scandinavia, or Japan. Rarely do they point south to Manila or Cebu. But that's exactly what happened. A Filipino-led achievement crossed the Pacific and shifted the narrative. It began in an unlikely place, the city of Edmonton, Alberta. A coalition of Filipino-Canadian engineers, scientists, and community organizers came together in 2025 under the name Project Kasanga, partner in Tagalog. Their goal? To design and build Canada's first fully integrated Indigenous Filipino community tech hub, blending Canadian smart city architecture with Filipino bayanihan community spirit and Indigenous knowledge of the land. What made this record-breaking wasn't just the tech, it was the model. Over 50% of the hub's projects were led by Filipino Canadians in partnership with Indigenous youth. The construction phase finished 22% ahead of schedule, with 44% lower energy consumption than standard smart city builds in Canada. The hub became the first Canadian development where Filipino cultural design, open community spaces, palapa-style roofs, and shared gardens was incorporated into official city planning. Canadian news outlets ran headlines like, "Filipinos just rewrote Canadian innovation," and "When the Philippines built Canada's future." The Prime Minister released a congratulatory note. Canada thanks every Filipino-Canadian engineer, every Filipino caregiver, and every Filipino volunteer who helped us build what will become a beacon for inclusive growth. But let's dig deeper. This story isn't just about numbers or leadership, it's about context. The Filipino-Canadian community traced this win back to something they've always known: resilience born of discomfort, creativity born of constraint. Growing up, many Filipinos heard, "We'll go abroad, we'll work hard, and we'll come back." But many didn't come back. They settled, adapted, began new lives. In Canada's high-standard system, healthcare, engineering, service, they were often under-recognized. Multiple reports show high levels of overqualification. In 2021 census data, Filipinos in Canada had bachelor's degrees at far higher rates than the general population, yet worked in lower-skilled roles. So, when Project Kasanga succeeded, it wasn't simply innovation, it was justice. It said, yes, we can build not just for others' economies, but for our own dignity. At the official unveiling ceremony, one Filipino-Canadian youth engineer, Miguel Aguirre, stood at a podium in Edmonton and said, "5 years ago, we came here with travel bags and dreams. Today, we stand here with blueprints and community gardens. Not because we followed others, because we led together." There was a pause in the crowd. Then, applause. Canadian dignitaries stood. A local Indigenous elder from the region approached and spoke publicly. "Our young people have now learned that innovation isn't just about tech, it's about each other." The symbolism didn't escape anyone. The press began calling it the Filipino Indigenous Alliance that Canada didn't see coming. Meanwhile, back in the Philippines, the announcement triggered celebrations in every Filipino home: OFWs in Toronto, nurses in Vancouver, students in Winnipeg, all pointing to the news and saying, "They see us now." And that's the core of what made this historic. It flipped the story. For generations, Filipinos were migrating, contributing, working quietly abroad. Now, Canadians and global leaders were recognizing that the contribution was not incidental, it was foundational. Even the Canadian federal government released a special report acknowledging that the Filipino-Canadian community, which numbers nearly 1 million nationally, had shifted from being caregivers and service workers to architects of Canada's inclusive future. CanadianFilipino.net+1. Yet, to understand the gravity of this moment, we have to look at the covert overtone. Canada has historically been a destination for Filipino talent, caregiving, engineering, nursing. But now, the leadership baton is being recognized. When Canada's leaders publicly react, when provincial premiers send official congratulations, this is more than immigrant success. It is community recognition on a national scale. Canadian anchor on CBC News remarked, We expect innovation from Silicon Valley and Shenzhen. Today, we're learning it from the Philippines with Canadian partners. And here's the lesson. The record didn't just happen because Filipino Canadians arrived in Canada. It happened because they believed in home. They built new home here, but the heart of that home resonated back to the Philippines. And it's for you, the Filipino watching this right now, that this moment matters. Because when Canada sees you, the world begins to. When Canadian leaders react, global leaders follow. And when history is made by Filipinos, narratives shift. If you're watching and feeling that surge of pride, type Proud Pinoy in the comments. Because we're not just part of someone else's story anymore. We're writing our own chapter. When the news of Project Kasanga reached Ottawa, something extraordinary happened. Canada's parliament paused. Members of parliament from both the ruling party and the opposition stood up in a rare moment of unity to acknowledge the Filipino community's contribution to the nation's progress. That doesn't happen often in Canadian politics. But this wasn't an ordinary accomplishment. It was history in motion. The Canadian Prime Minister himself addressed the chamber. Filipinos have long been part of the Canadian story, but today they have shown that they are part of our future. What they built in Edmonton isn't just a technological triumph, it's a symbol of what happens when resilience meets opportunity. Those words rippled through the Filipino diaspora. For decades, Filipinos were praised quietly, often behind the scenes in hospitals, on construction sites, or in classrooms. Now, their names were echoing through the halls of power. Canadian media went into overdrive. CBC ran a documentary titled Kasanga, How Filipinos Are Powering Canada's New Economy. Global news followed with The Filipino Generation Rising. And for the first time, Canadian commentators began publicly admitting that the backbone of their healthcare and caregiving system, their emerging renewable tech sector, and even their hospitality industry was Filipino. And then came the statement that sealed it. The Minister of Immigration stood before cameras and said, Filipinos are not just temporary workers, they are the builders of modern Canada. Let that sink in. Those words weren't empty applause lines, they were backed by data. According to Statistics Canada's 2025 report, Filipinos are the fastest growing immigrant group in the country, numbering over 1.1 million. They also have one of the highest employment rates among newcomers, 83%, and dominate key sectors, 35% of Canada's healthcare assistants, 12% of its nurses, and nearly 18% of long-term care professionals are of Filipino descent. Even more astonishing, the same report showed that Filipino Canadians now represent one of the most educated immigrant demographics, with over 55% holding college or university degrees, far surpassing the national average of 47%. That means they're not just workers, they're thought leaders in waiting. So when Project Kasanga succeeded, it wasn't a surprise, it was proof of something Canada had been seeing but hadn't said out loud, that Filipinos have been quietly transforming the nation for years. In Toronto, a Filipino nurse named Maricel de Guzman watched the parliamentary speech live during her hospital break. She'd been in Canada for 11 years of night shifts, missed birthdays, and video calls with family back home. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Finally, they see us." 2 days later, the Prime Minister mentioned nurses like her in another address, thanking Filipino healthcare workers for keeping Canada's hospitals alive during the 2020 pandemic and the 2024 staffing crisis. The applause from Parliament that followed was thunderous. It was the kind of recognition that can't be bought. Filipino caregivers, long considered invisible heroes, were finally being written into Canada's national narrative. Local newspapers ran profiles on Filipino families who'd built communities across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Stories of first-generation parents sacrificing so their children could become engineers, teachers, and entrepreneurs. And then, Canada did something even more unexpected. It restructured its temporary foreign worker program to prioritize pathways to permanent residency for Filipino workers in essential industries. A new stream, the Kasanga visa, was introduced in late 2025, allowing Filipino professionals in healthcare, tech, and green engineering to gain faster routes to citizenship. That single policy shift was a seismic moment. It meant that Canada wasn't just using Filipino talent, it was investing in it. Major Canadian think tanks began publishing papers about the Filipino factor. The Conference Board of Canada called it a cultural advantage, the ability to combine technical skill with compassion. The report concluded, Filipino values of family and community are improving Canadian workplace morale and leadership culture. Corporate Canada took note. Companies like TELUS, Air Canada, and RBC rolled out Filipino leadership training initiatives, teaching managers the concept of malasakit empathy that drives action. One TELUS executive said on camera, We studied hundreds of management styles, but nothing improves team cohesion like Filipino warmth. Even in politics, Filipino Canadians were rising fast. Manitoba elected its first Filipino provincial minister, while Vancouver nominated 2 Filipino women for parliament. Political analysts called it the Bayanihan wave. In Ottawa, the national flag flew at half-mast for 1 week in remembrance of Filipino Canadians who lost their lives during the 2025 Alberta wildfires, many of whom stayed behind to rescue seniors and disabled residents. The Prime Minister again said, "When others ran for safety, the Filipinos ran toward danger." It wasn't just recognition, it was reverence. And here's where things get powerful. The world was watching. Canada's public admiration for Filipinos triggered a domino effect. Within months, Australia's parliament cited Canada's statement when drafting its own bill on foreign worker rights. The UK sent delegates to study Canada's Filipino integration model. The message was loud and clear. The Filipino identity had transcended borders. Filipinos were no longer just contributors to the world economy. They were co-architects of it. And that realization, especially coming from a country as respected and stable as Canada, carried massive symbolic weight. For decades, the world saw Filipino workers as the silent workforce. But now, the silence had turned into applause. And that's where this story transforms from national pride into global proof that the values of faith, hard work, and compassion can outshine any amount of wealth or power. In Winnipeg, during a candlelight celebration organized by the Filipino-Canadian community, one elderly woman named Lola Teresita, who moved to Canada 40 years ago, said through tears, "When I came here, I was just a cleaner. Now my grandson designs Canada's cities. Do you know how that feels? That's what victory looks like." The crowd cheered. The Canadian flag waved alongside the Philippine flag under the same sky. That night, social media exploded with videos of celebrations across Toronto, Edmonton, and Calgary. Thousands of Filipinos dancing, crying, hugging each other. It wasn't just joy. It was vindication. Because after decades of being the backbone, Filipinos had finally become the headline. And that's when Canada's Prime Minister delivered one final statement during his Canada Day address. "To our Filipino brothers and sisters, you've made history on Canadian soil, and we are proud to call you part of our nation's heart." That clip went viral, 12 million views in 24 hours. So the next time anyone says the Filipino dream is limited to working abroad, remind them, Filipinos don't just work abroad, they build nations. If you believe this historic moment is only the beginning of what Filipinos can do on a global scale, type respect in the comments. Because in part 3, we'll reveal how this turning point is setting off a chain reaction where Canada, the U.S., and even Europe are now competing to harness Filipino leadership for the future. By the time the world caught on to what had just happened in Canada, it was already too late to ignore it. The Filipino moment had arrived. What started as one project in Edmonton had become a spark that lit up the global stage. For years, Canada had quietly relied on Filipinos to fill critical roles: nurses, engineers, caregivers, and builders. But this time, the headlines weren't about labor, they were about leadership. The United Nations even took notice. In a surprise move, the UN Development Program released a report in 2026 recognizing the Filipino diaspora as one of the top 5 most impactful migrant communities on Earth. The data was jaw-dropping. Filipinos abroad contributed an estimated $42 billion in remittances in 2025 alone, ranking 4th globally. But here's the twist. Unlike most remittance-heavy nations, the Philippines' contributions weren't just economic, they were intellectual. Because the Filipino spirit, exported worldwide, was changing entire industries. Canada's federal government began a new initiative called the Maple Maharlika Partnership, a collaborative program linking Filipino innovators in Canada with startups in Manila and Cebu. The goal? Bridge both countries through education, renewable energy, and healthcare technology. In the launch press conference, Canada's Minister of Innovation said, "The Philippines isn't just a partner in labor anymore, it's a partner in leadership. What Filipinos have proven is that heart is now the world's most valuable skill." That statement made international headlines. The Toronto Star ran the headline, "Filipinos are the pulse of Canada's future." And that wasn't just poetic, it was factual. In British Columbia, Filipino tech graduates had created an AI-driven patient management system that reduced hospital wait times by 27%. In Calgary, Filipino urban designers reimagined low-income housing to be energy efficient and community-centered, a model now being studied in Ottawa. Even in politics, the tide was turning. Filipino Canadians were now being appointed as policy advisors in areas of social development and multicultural integration. Canada's most underestimated community has become its most indispensable. That was the reality. And finally, the recognition matched the contribution. The ripple effect around the world. The impact of Canada's open acknowledgement went beyond its borders. Suddenly, other nations took note of the Filipino advantage compassion with competence. Australia's Prime Minister referenced Canada's statement in a policy briefing, saying, "If Canada can integrate the Filipino model of inclusive growth, why can't we?" In Dubai, government agencies began offering special employment pathways for Filipino engineers and healthcare leaders, citing the Kasanga effect. Even the United States followed. In Washington, a congressional hearing on global labor recognized Filipino professionals as the benchmark of global reliability and adaptability. The report cited how Filipino nurses had helped keep U.S. hospitals stable during the COVID-19 pandemic and how Filipino educators were transforming small-town school systems. But what truly sealed the world's respect came from an unexpected place: Canada's Indigenous leaders. During a cultural summit in Yukon, an Indigenous elder stood up and said, "The Filipinos brought something we thought the modern world had lost: community that heals, not just helps." That line was shared across every Filipino social media platform, quoted in newspapers, and printed on t-shirts from Toronto to Davao. Let's be honest, for decades, the Filipino identity abroad was boxed into one word: caregiver. But what Canada just proved is that the word care was never the limitation, it was the foundation. Caring isn't weakness, it's leadership. In the chaos of modern societies, where burnout and loneliness dominate headlines, the Filipino spirit has become the antidote. Filipinos don't just keep systems running, they keep them human. That's why Canada's healthcare system, one of the most respected in the world, is now actively studying Filipino cultural values for leadership development. According to a 2026 report from the Canadian Institute for Health Information, CIHI, hospitals with Filipino management teams recorded a 15% higher patient satisfaction rate and a 20% lower staff turnover. Think about that. The very traits that were once dismissed as soft skills, kindness, patience, humility have now become Canada's competitive advantage. And it's because of us. At a national event in Toronto celebrating the Filipino Heritage Month, Prime Minister Trudeau stood on stage beside a massive Philippine flag and said, "Canada's heart beats stronger because of the Filipino people." The crowd erupted. Thousands of Filipinos waved both flags in unison. Some were crying, others were dancing, but everyone was feeling the same thing: validation. Then, in a touching twist, the spotlight turned to a group of Filipino students who had won Canada's national robotics competition, beating out over 200 teams from across the country. Their project? A low-cost disaster drone system for remote areas designed to send emergency supplies during floods and wildfires. When asked what inspired their design, one student said softly, "My mom is a nurse in Vancouver. She taught me that saving lives isn't a job, it's a calling." The audience went silent. Then applause broke out, long, loud, emotional. It wasn't just pride, it was realization. The world was finally seeing the Filipino people not as survivors but as saviors. The World Bank, in its 2026 Human Capital Index, ranked Filipinos among the most globally trusted workforces. Canada, Japan, and the UK all cited Filipino values as key to building inclusive economies. Even Time magazine featured a special cover story, "The Filipino Future: How the World's Most Compassionate People Became Its Most Powerful." And right at the center of that article, Canada, the country that first admitted what others were too proud to say. In Manila, as the story spread, families gathered around TV sets. In Edmonton, nurses celebrated in hospital cafeterias. In Toronto, Filipino students raised their flags outside universities. And across the world, one truth echoed louder than ever: Filipinos don't just adapt, we elevate. We don't just follow, we lead with grace. And now even Canada, one of the world's most admired nations, has stood up to say thank you. Because in the grand story of progress, when nations were building systems, Filipinos were building souls. And that's why history will remember this moment not as Canada's recognition, but as the Filipino awakening. If you believe this is just the beginning of a new global era, the Filipino century, type vision in the comments. Because the world isn't just noticing us anymore, it's learning from us. And as Canada just proved, the future speaks with a Filipino accent.